If you had told me 3 years ago that we would be where we are today as a thesis, as a fund, as a group of founders who are building the national interest, I wouldn't have believed you.
People in Silicon Valley were really trying to figure out what was important, how do I want to spend my time, building things that they feel really, really proud about, that really serve an important mission.
The fact that this movement moved faster than any of us anticipated says something about the organic nature of founders wanting to build in the physical world.
Deep tech, frontier tech, hard tech. What does hard tech mean? Lots of things are hard. What does deep tech mean?
The fact that we said America, I do think was shocking. I still think it shocks people. For decades, it was very taboo to say you were building only for one country. Tech was by its nature global.
Good ideas do spread virally very, very fast.
If there's an executive department in Washington that exists to regulate or oversee an industry, that is likely American dynamism.
So it's been about 3 years since the term, the thesis, American dynamism came to be. Tell us more about the origins of the term and where we've come since then.
Dee, you and I constantly reflect on this because I am the eternal optimist, early stage investor, only see roses. And if you had told me 3 years ago that we would be where we are today as a thesis, as a fund, as a group of founders who are building the national interest, I wouldn't have believed you. Like, there's just no way that anyone could have predicted how quickly this movement took hold. And you know, people inside of Andreessen Horowitz know that I have this little framework for how I describe the sort of meme magic of Andreessen Horowitz. And I say we always go from thesis to meme to product. And I would have assumed that that sort of meme cycle of putting out something that's a really, you know, well thought, serious piece of this is our thesis, this is where we're going to focus, seeing sort of the broader community meme it and allow it to evolve with the help of founders, with the help of engineers. I thought that would take 10 years. I thought we'd be sitting here in 10 years saying, okay, we have a fund, like it's incredible that American dynamism is something that every fund is taking seriously. So the fact that we've done it in 3 and the fact that this movement moved faster than any of us anticipated says something about just the I would say the organic nature of founders wanting to build in the physical world. Coupled with things like the war in Ukraine, you know, we launched the thesis 3 weeks before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. And so I think there were just a number of factors, you know, the combination of the founders, the moment, the capital really saying this is something that is needed, and it really resonating across the board.
I think that all of the sort of demand polls that Katherine just mentioned were there. Like, the world needed this. America needed this. People needed change, and they wanted people to start building for things that mattered. But I think there was a supply side change as well. I think all the engineers and founders were hungry for doing something that was more meaningful. I think they wanted to tackle bigger problems. They wanted to do things. They sort of saw things like SpaceX starting to like really actually happen, like launch was happening. And this idea that like that could be made real just seemed much more tangible than ever before. People watched what happened with Tesla, where, you know, they remember it started with the Roadster, but then all of a sudden it became commonplace, and there was a supercharging network that was created. And I think people just recognize, hey, wait a minute, I don't need to be optimizing ad clicks. I can act, which is fine if they want to do that. But instead, they can really spend their time building things that they feel really, really proud about, that really serve an important mission. You know, even in some of the origins where some of the AD companies started, it was after Google bailed out of Project Maven, and people in Silicon Valley were really trying to figure out what was important, how do I want to spend my time, and those early seeds, you know, blossomed into what now, you know, Katherine coined as the American dynamism practice. So even though the practice and the fund came a little bit later, there were lots of seeds that had been planted even as early as 2018. So I think you're seeing a crescendo that had gained momentum. And then, you know, I think we were able to really capitalize on that. And, you know, I actually still think we're just in the earliest innings.
Can I just ask about that in particular, the note about the fact that there was a period of time where actually many technologists were not just careful with supporting the national interest, but actually, in some cases, actively against it, right? You mentioned memes, Katherine. Like, the term American dynamism, like, did this idea of supporting the national interest, did it need a rebranding? And how effective do you think, you know, again, something like American dynamism, which is so compelling, what role did that play, if any?
Well, you said something interesting there, which was, did it need a rebranding? And there was no brand. The idea of building for the national interest, when we said it, was extremely controversial, even 3 years ago. Like, the reason why I think people were stunned was partially because of the name, because we actually said the word America. For
Yeah.
for decades, it was very taboo to say you were building only for one country. Tech was by its nature global. It's you build software, you want to see it go completely international. Like the idea that you would say, no, actually, there are companies by law that can't sell to other countries. And we have an entire regulatory regime around how those companies are built, who they can work with, who our allies are, and we need to respect that. We actually need to build a practice because those companies are going to be the next phase of innovation. Today, it's seen as like, this is an obvious thesis. But even a couple years ago, that was seen as, are you crazy? Like, are our limited partners going to get behind that? Are engineers going to want to say they're building for the national interest? Like, there was the language that we used was very specific because it signified a specific type of company that is highly regulated, that builds in the physical world, that has to worry about, the status of their engineers and can they get top secret clearances. So I think in some ways, we named it that, one, because it exemplifies what we are doing here. And it's, we didn't name it defense tech, right? We named it dynamism,
Yes.
which is so important to the actual thing that we are building. But the fact that we said America, I do think was shocking. I still think it shocks people. But when you actually look at the companies and how they're building for specific, they're either selling to government, they're working with, the different states that they operate in, they're selling to various levels of government. And they understand the seriousness of building a company like that, where the language actually does matter.
It's always been funny, I think, to Katherine and I, when we think about the occasional criticisms we would hear, people sometimes would say American dynamism, that's just a marketing term. It doesn't mean anything, but obviously it means something because it's galvanized a whole movement. And they would say, it's just this marketing thing. And I would say to myself, well, wait a minute, what company doesn't have marketing? Like, what enterprise software company is not going to have a marketing team or a marketing department? Who doesn't put together marketing materials to explain what they're about, what they stand for, what they do? Like, who doesn't want marketing? Like, what is wrong with marketing? You say it like it's this pejorative, but it's like, who doesn't? What kind of idiot would run a company without marketing? We have competitors at other venture firms that go to just incredible lengths to come up with alternative phrasing to not say American dynamism, industrial revolution, resilience. It's like, okay, like those are all good words, but they're all encompassed by American dynamism. And the other thing about American dynamism was just so clear early on that it's only positive. It only has a positive connotation. There is no negative way to interpret American dynamism. It doesn't mean that the rest of the world has to be conquered or suffers. It's not any of those things. All it says is that we want to promote American dynamism. And people can read that and hear that and say, you know what, that's about improving the state of education, of housing, of defense, of energy. It's all these things that are the cornerstones and building blocks. And so there wasn't as much criticism. People just kind of brushed it aside like any new thing. Or they didn't want to acknowledge how good of an idea it was. But because it was such a good idea, and it really, I think, resonated with the builders and the founders, it really did galvanize this sort of overwhelming momentum. Kind of like Katherine says, the meme takes hold quickly. Like, good ideas do spread virally very, very fast. And with our LPs, I do think, and even today, there is still a little bit of an effort to convince them it's not just about defense. Defense is an important part of it. But it's not just about defense. And but I think now, 3 years in, they are starting to see that and understand that, and they recognize that there's things like public safety, which they had never really imagined as being part of American dynamism, are now increasingly important cornerstones of what we're doing.
One thing I'll add to what you just said, it was shocking to Silicon Valley. It was not shocking to Washington. And I think that's also really important. Like, the term American dynamism is a term that you would hear in DC and all sorts of contexts to refer to the innovation they care about. So it was not surprising at all to Washington. I actually think it was embraced immediately. But that goes to show you just the gulf between how DC views innovation and how, Silicon Valley views innovation, and how in some ways this practice wants to push those two worlds closer together. But it certainly wasn't controversial in Washington. I think when we go to DC, it is like exceptionally embraced. People are so excited that Silicon Valley is building for these categories. And from day one, the people in DC and Washington got it. It was more of a surprise for the people in Silicon Valley, many of whom who still had funds that were operating in China. It was more of a surprise for them. And now I don't think it's a surprise for anyone. I think everyone gets the thesis and is on board with the message.
There were so many other terms that people would try to use before American Dynamism that I think sort of either made no sense or didn't capture. I mean, forget about the fact that they just like weren't interesting and didn't galvanize a lot of excitement, but like deep tech, frontier tech, hard tech. It was like, well, what does hard tech mean? What is, lots of things are hard. What does deep tech mean? I don't know. Frontier tech people would use, and we never used those terms because frankly, they just never made any sense, and certainly they also were just boring, stupid terms.
They weren't galvanizing, that's for sure.
For sure.
Maybe one thing to clarify for folks, because I think you called it out, DU. A lot of people associate American Dynamism specifically with defense and maybe aerospace. But there's so much more to that story. So I'd love for either one of you to just clarify, like, what are the other areas of American Dynamism? How do you view the overarching nature of supporting the national interest?
Anybody that thinks that they're building in the national interest can take a really broad lens as to what that means, and we welcome those people. I think, as Katherine will say, like the tent is big, and we welcome anybody into that tent. Doesn't mean we're going to be investing in all those areas, but if somebody, whether they're working in areas of education, agriculture, manufacturing, material sciences, battery sciences, different kinds of chemistry and chemicals and things that are really critical to our national supply chain and our industrial supply chain, energy, which is we have this insatiable thirst for energy in this country. Like all these things are part of American Dynamism. Defense is obviously a part of it. And the manufacturing base that goes along with that, and the entire defense industrial base and supply chain that goes along with it, logistics, trucking. There's all these things that people, I think, underestimate the impact that technology can have in these categories. And all these things have such a positive and beneficial impact on America. But obviously, the healthcare and education, those things are just key parts of what people think of as part of the American dream. And anyone that thinks that they're building in the national interest, we tend to welcome.
I always say, if there's an executive department in Washington that exists to regulate or oversee an industry, that is likely American Dynamism. So think Department of Energy, Department of of Defense, Department of State, FBI. Like we see public safety as a huge component of American Dynamism, and it really is these categories where there's just strong civic interest, like where Americans say this is the place where this is why we have a government. These are the services that government is supposed to support us on. And as DU said, it's a very wide array of places that we cover. But the real fundamental reason why we built a fund and a practice is because these companies sell in very different ways than all of the other companies in our portfolio. And this is something that I think DU and I saw in the early days before we even had a practice, where these one-off companies had these extraordinary business models, whether it's something like Anduril or SpaceX or Flock Safety, but they're all very different. But government is like their core customer, and they have to figure out how to work with their core customer in a very bespoke way. And, in DC, they have, what they call federal practices, right? But Silicon Valley had no concept of what does a federal practice look like. Like, you never heard that word in Silicon Valley. I often say DC got what we were doing a lot earlier than the people in Silicon Valley, but now it's just sort of an obvious thing. Of course, there's all these companies that want to work with government. They're going to need different types of operating teams. They're going to need a different go-to-market motion. They're going to have to understand this weird term called government affairs. In some ways, it's like these companies operate very differently.